Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this iteration of the Hague Program's book seminars. Today we have a really exciting speaker with us, Max Smeets, who will be speaking on his book, Ransom War: How Cybercrime Became a Threat to National Security. And Max Smeets has a really interesting background. He's currently a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. He's also the co-director of Virtual Roots, which I'm sure this community is aware of. And he's written several books on cyber conflict and other related topics. And today he will be exploring the ransomware landscape. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Max and we'll begin with a presentation followed by questions. So if you have any questions, please do keep them close to hand. And after Max concludes his discussion, which will be about 20 minutes, we'll go into Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, please go ahead. Sorry, did you want to say something, Julia?
No, sorry, Max. Please go ahead.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for introducing me. And I'm really excited to have this hour with all of you. I prepared some slides, but I'm quite frankly not sure if I should use them or not use them. Some people like them because I probably will speak a bit more in a structured fashion. I'm also afraid at the same time that it will lose a bit of interaction. So to sort of get started, if people could put a hand up if they don't want to speak me with slides, and if they want to speak with slides, then please keep your hands down. I'll give you a minute or so, or 10 seconds. No hands up, or unless no one is joining yet, we can't. Can they do hands up? Yes, right? Okay.
Yep, I think
no
so.
hands up. That suggests that I should speak with slides. Okay, let's go ahead and immediately share my screen, choose a tab, and then get going. Right, so now you should see this tab, and I've put it in slideshow. Good.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, so as Julia mentioned, I plan to speak for about 20 minutes, and the way that I've structured it is to briefly talk about the background of why I wrote this book, and then highlight one of the key principles that comes out of it, and then really happy to move to questions depending on whatever you find most interesting. So I want to go back around 3 years ago when I actually presented at the same The Hague seminar online about my previous book, No Shortcuts. I've been working on that book for almost a decade. It was also part of my PhD, and it focused on military cyber operations. And when I finished that book, I wouldn't say I got into a bit of an identity crisis, but I certainly started to question as to whether I should continue working on military cyber operations. And of course, a lot of interesting things were going on at the time. The further invasion of Ukraine at some point, you had the development of the UK National Cyber Force, and so on and so on. And I felt it deserved a degree of attention that would be worthy for another book. It also felt the easy thing to do. And yet at the same time, I was also feeling the need to look into other topics that had gained prominence and deserved more attention. And ultimately, I really felt I had to make a decision between the sort of red pill going down the AI route, which of course many have done for good reason, or actually move into the more cyber criminal space with a particular focus on ransomware. And I decided to take the blue pill, and decided to do that for really 3 different reasons. First of all is that I felt that we have seen ransomware evolve to the extent that it has really become a national security problem, to the extent that people like me with an international relations background really require or deserve to study this. We can think of a variety of different incidents that are so notable that they deserve our attention of national security scholars. This includes the attacks against the government of Costa Rica by a group called Conti that ultimately led the government to declare a national state of emergency and state of war, the first time ever that a country has done that in response to any type of cyber attack. We can think of significant incidents in the US, like Colonial Pipeline, disrupting oil supply across the East Coast. I think of TSMC hack, of course, chip manufacturer in Taiwan, You can think of Kaseya that hit many other companies through a supply chain attack. So really major incidents, to the extent that, in fact, in the UK, the majority of national security emergency meetings that were held 2 years ago were about ransomware incidents over any other type of national security incident. So it was really bubbled up to the top agenda of national security policymakers. And yet at the same time, the amount of scholars, particularly in political science, where I'm from, working on this subject was really tiny. Still today, there is not a single article in the top 125 journal of political science that discusses ransomware, and very few books have been written too. And yet, the third element is there's just so much to analyze. In my book, I focus on one key form of data in particular, which relates to a group called Conti. Conti was the biggest ransomware group in 2021, at least by known ransomware payments. It made a revenue of between 180 million and 1.2 billion in that year. And what happened following the further invasion of Ukraine is that someone who had access to the back end of their Jabber and Rocket chat, so these are essentially their WhatsApp and Slack message channels, leaked a lot of internal messages from July 2022 to March 2022, March 2022. And this overall gives you an extremely unique insight in how Conti members operate when they pick up their kids from school, how they negotiate, et cetera, et cetera. So use this as one of my key sources for this book. But if you think about the ransomware landscape overall, this is not a singular leak. We have seen several other leaks, and there is a lot of other data that deserves attention as well. For instance, leak data or data that has been published between negotiations of affiliates and victims, including that of 2 weeks ago with Lockbit. So an enormous amount to analyze, much more so, I would say, than what I was doing in my previous book on military cyber operations. So that's in short sort of the background as to why I decided to study it. But let me then very briefly talk about the objectives. And those are threefold, sort of the typical book objectives that you will find. I wanted to have some type of theoretical contribution, clearly an empirical one too, and also want to speak to policy. And that is reflected in the outline of my book. So in the first chapters, I first described the rise of ransomware and how this has now really become a national security threat. But then I set up a new framework. I call this the MOP framework, which we have to analyze ransomware groups through. MOP stands for modus operandi, organizational structure, and branding. And I discussed these three different components and how they interact and how we have to study them and the type of data that we need to then study ransomware groups when it comes to, how they're gaining access to networks, how they are subsequently encrypting, decrypting, paying themselves out, but also how they're organized, how hierarchical they sometimes are, how unhierarchical they are at other times, to what degree they have work from home practices, but also at times work in office spaces, etc. And the branding reputation, which I will delve into mostly for this remainder of this talk, around how they position themselves to the public. So that was sort of the first, hopefully, contribution that I'm making. And then this empirical contribution is this deep dive into not just Conti, but also its predecessors, where people have written on this group before, but by no extent as comprehensively, and really trying to lay out how a group of this kind functions, and also things in sometimes startup or business-like terms about expansion and the way in which they engage. And it includes a chapter on what I call pioneering as well, which is its relationship with the Russian state. And then I end with a policy chapter that I will get to as well, which is, of course, extremely relevant considering ongoing policy discussions today. So that's that. Now, if you look at this outline, there is, I've set it up in this way, but there is one principle, which I call the ransomware trust paradox, that runs essentially throughout the book. So what I plan to do for this 10 minutes that we still have left is to not talk about one specific chapter. For that, go and read the book. But instead talk about a principle that runs through all of them, and I think is really important for understanding of how ransomware groups operate. And I call this principle the ransomware trust paradox. It's a really simple one. First of all, I argue that this paradox exists. And what it means is the following. Despite the inherently deceiving activities of ransomware groups, with deceiving here broadly defined, how they gain access, the stealing of data, the encrypting of someone's data, at the same time, these groups need to gain the trust of their victims. Without gaining the trust, ransomware groups cannot be profitable. And with trust here, I mean two different elements. First of all, these ransomware groups need to be seen as skillful enough. Now, what do I mean with this is that when they are, for example, encrypting your data, which is by no means always an easy feat, especially doing this in a relatively quick, stealthy manner and doing this on a scale, an enterprise scale as well, that after they've done that, that they actually have a decryptor that works. You need to believe that if you're paying 100,000, a million, or even more, that decryptor is going to function and help you get out of this crisis situation. So there is a skilled element, but then there is also a sort of reliable element. The victim needs to believe that after they have paid $1 million, that you do not continue, for example, your extortion, that you will provide a decryptor, that you will not leak the data online, that you will not re-victimize them, and that you will actually delete the data off your own server after you've stolen it. If the victim doesn't believe that you're doing these things, the victim is not going to pay. So actually for ransomware, we can talk about a whole range of things, very specifics on the type of phishing email they write or where they set up their C2 infrastructure. But really, the question that really gets to the core of these ransomware groups is, how do they develop trust? And they do this in a number of different ways, as I explain in the book, but one that really stands out is reputation building. But before I get to that, let's talk about just a couple of different ways that we can conceive of them doing this. What we know from anthropology and sociology literature is that often groups, there is a lot of inter and intra-group trust when there are shared values and identities. That's why there is so much trust within tribes. And we see this with ransomware groups as well, although rarely is that effective. So you will see, for instance, on one of the leak site pages of a group called the Lost Trust Team, you will see them writing that they are just like any other pen tester. They're a bunch of, for instance, young people that are just doing this because they are not getting paid enough in their real job, and they are just doing this to make some extra money. But they are like any one of us. A not very effective strategy, but you see this coming up across different groups at times. What's more effective is the same principle that we will see in businesses. We know in business that a key form to develop trust is repeated communications and being transparent. If I will tell you I'm going to do this at 8 a.m. and I'm following up at 9 a.m. and I've actually done that, and then I'm going to say at 12, hey, I'm now going to log off and I'm going to go back online in an hour, et cetera, that degree of communication with your teammates is known to help in business settings. And clearly, this is something that ransomware groups do too. You will find a group like 8base that used to have their frequently asked questions page on the website, where it would lay out, in case they got hit, in case you are a victim of their ransomware, what are the steps you can expect to follow, and what are the typical questions that might come up, right? Or you will have other groups that are very like Clop, that have a 24/7 service that you can reach out to for any of your questions that you have. Now you have been part of this sort of uncomfortable situation. A third form of trust is to demonstrate capability. Think about a car vendor that will that will allow you to take the car for a test ride to basically showcase this car is working. The main way in which ransomware groups do this today, and this is a development from roughly the last 3.5 years, is they will always allow you to decrypt a couple of files for free. They say, just pick a few, and we will show you essentially that the decryptor works. It's this demonstration of capability to make sure that the victim believes that after they've paid, they can actually get their data back. But the key way in which to develop trust is really this reputation element, or what in the political science literature would be called reputational hostage taking. It's a bit similar to, making sure you have enough reviews on Amazon or another place, and that will really help you in this space. The worst thing that can happen to a ransomware group is that the first 10 search results on Google say that this group is unreliable and doesn't pay. The moment that that's the case, the ransomware group has to rebrand. So they're really relying on their reputation. And you will find this both frequently stated in their ransom notes, but also in other relevant communication with their victims, including when they start to negotiate. Reputation is sort of not everything, but it plays a crucial role in this trust building endeavor. And with reputation, there is an almost entirely different discussion that we can have, but importantly connects to it around branding, where you see these different groups using different brands, using different names to really ensure that they get known and get related in the same way as Coca-Cola or whatever typical brand does this to the extreme extents, right? Where you will have Lockbit in the top right, paying people $1,000 in Bitcoin if they tattoo the logo somewhere on a body part. And there are different strategies that ransomware groups use when it comes to their branding. The group that I studied most closely, Conti, their strategy was one to create multiple brands that they try to essentially disconnect from the Conti mother brand. So one of the brands that they created is called Diavol. They really tried to create this locker with zero code overlap with Conti, which ultimately, due to mistake, they didn't succeed in. And it created a degree of resilience, right? That if law enforcement would take down Conti, it would then be able to quite quickly move towards Diavol and continue their operations. But it also allowed for a degree of re-victimization. If Conti would have hit a victim and promises to not go after this victim again, essentially you can go after them again under a different brand, in this case, Diavol. You also had a very interesting case around Karakurt. So Karakurt is, at least according to some, and what comes quite clear from the leaks, at least the brand that is affiliated with Conti, and one of the motivations that seemed to be the case on why it was created is because it is a data-only extortion arm. So what happens with Karakurt is that they don't encrypt your data, but only steal your data and then ask for ransom. But what seems to be in reality the case is that these are Conti operations. And when Conti is not quick enough to also encrypt, so they've stolen your data but not decrypted your data, they hand over essentially the operation to the Karakurt brand. And Karakurt is then doing data extortion only. So it's a bit like a chef that has leftover ingredients and decides to make a soup of it. So you see these groups playing with different brands and doing this in a variety of different ways. All right, let's move on. So ransomware, the trust paradox exists. Ransomware groups thus need to develop this trust. Third element is that to overcome the trust paradox, ransomware groups actually operate differently from APTs, and particularly your nation-state intel operated APTs. So APTs stand for advanced persistent threats, not only, but most frequently they refer to nation-state activity. And when we think about that nation-state activity, oftentimes these groups want to shy away from public attention. Think about Chinese IP theft. They don't want to be publicly attributed about the operations or campaigns that they have conducted. And the same for many Western entities, they wouldn't want this either. For ransomware groups, that's almost the opposite. Of course, they don't want to be disclosed the moment they are still gaining access to a network. But after that, they actually, love to be in the public and they love to be written about because it enhances their reputation. So you see a very different dynamic going on when it comes to the way in which these are engaging with the public. And that also distinguishes ransomware groups, those criminal ones that are doing it for profit, from the state actors that are using ransomware. And I've recently published a report on the virtual roots with a couple of colleagues from different organizations that looks at this into more detail, at Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, how they are using ransomware, because there is a growing trend. But when, in short, we look at that, you see, for instance, Russian actors like Sandworm, those known for highly disruptive operations, conducting ransomware activity, but only doing this really to promote their operational tempo in Ukraine. They don't need to overcome the ransomware trust paradox because they don't need to gain financial benefits from that. Similarly, when China is using ransomware in Latin America, they're doing this often to enhance plausible deniability. They steal IP, then they conduct a ransomware operation, which muddies the waters. Was this really, IP theft, or was this really ransom? Perhaps an interesting exception is North Korea, which is doing it for profit. It's struggling to overcome the ransomware trust paradox, but in principle, one of the key things that we know it's doing is at times trying to co-opt ransomware brands, so pretending that it is REvil or another ransomware group instead of it being, of course, North Korea, in the hope that it can benefit from the trust that this particular brand has in being paid out. They're also increasingly inserting themselves in the broader ransomware ecosystem. All right, let me move on and talk just 2-3 more minutes to you about the last two steps. So if this is the case, and if they operate differently than APTs, the next element to be aware of is how we then engage with ransomware groups. And I mean, we, which includes the cyber threat intel community, the media, but also academia, policy, and anyone else. And I've created this perhaps not very, let me say, nuanced meme to capture a broader trend that we are seeing. What we see today is a growing cycle, or a faster cycle, of ransomware brands that have been created. And that comes for a variety of reasons. One is the impact of law enforcement, but the other one is the ability of ransomware groups to actually rebrand and get recognized for it. 5 years ago, if you were a ransomware group, or certainly 10 years ago, you had to be extremely noisy to get any attention. There was maybe 1 or 2 individuals, Lawrence Abrahams and others, that would write on ransomware, but there was hardly any attention paid. Today, you don't even have to do an operation. You just establish a leak site, and you will see quite literally dozens, if not more, articles just being written on the fact that this new leak site has come up, or this single operation has been conducted, which helps shape the branding and reputation of these groups at times, especially if then we see discussions about these groups' professionalism, fierceness, and so on. You see this also in, for instance, the Conti ransom strain, especially the later versions, where they, for instance, very explicitly state, if you don't know us, just Google us, or, other ransomware groups that point out to specific government declarations and other material that talks about them, and who they are, and the fact that these are really professional groups. So the last is about policy. And it's worth mentioning that when I wrote the book, I thought that this was going to be the easiest part. I thought, after I'm going to do my analysis, I'm going to write this policy chapter at the end. And basically what I'm going to say is like, we need to think about policy. People haven't done it so before. Here are 3 things to do. And what I realized is that would be a deeply unfair way of writing, because in fact, especially in the last few years, so much has been done against ransom. And so instead, what I've done as the first part is to create a database of all known government ransomware countermeasures. And I've published this tracker on the Virtual Roots website. To my knowledge, it is very inclusive, the most comprehensive certainly out there, with the exception of what happened in the last 6 weeks, because I haven't updated yet. But you can find, really a wide range of different activities that we have seen governments undertaking. And this is particularly from 2021, where you see this surge in ransomware countermeasures, where we see smaller things coming up, from alerts against new strains, the takedown of C2 infrastructure, the sanctioning of cryptocurrency wallets, etc. We also have seen a growing number of sanctions against individuals, indictments against individuals, and/or arrests at times against individuals, especially when they are not operating from Russia. So we have seen a lot of disruption of ransomware groups' modus operandi. We've seen a fair bit of growing disruption or countermeasures against ransomware groups' organizational structure. But where we have not seen much, if anything at all, is on the B side, the B pillar side of my mob framework, the branding and reputation. There are way fewer efforts to undermine the trust of these ransomware groups between the ransomware groups and the victims. We have in some ways gone after these ransomware groups in the same way as we have gone after APTs. And what should be clear from this brief talk is that exactly going after the trust element should be a key measure of your countermeasures element. We've seen these international activities now as well that are growing, but also there's been both on the more think tank side with the counter-ransomware initiative, as well as this initiative from the government side. Both of the task force and initiative have not even included the trust element. There is one, however, really clear notable exception, which is the takedown of Lockbit by the NCA, the group that was the biggest after Conti, an affiliate-based group, where the NCA didn't just seek to disrupt the modus operandi of this group by going after their C2 infrastructure, and in fact, obtaining this in its entirety, including its leak site, etc., going after specific individuals with, sometimes doxing them on their own leak site, sometimes arresting certain individuals, but also was very careful to spread the message of this group not being reliable to the wider public, being very clear to reporters or researchers like myself, tell the public that Lockbit does not delete your data, even if they promise to do so. Tell the public that Lockbit doesn't ban people from their forum, even if they tell you when they have conducted operations against the healthcare. So they've been really keen to also ensure that brand element of Lockbit is disrupted/destroyed, to making it much harder to recover. Last point, if people believe me, where we should go and that this ransomware trust paradox exists, at a minimum, what we should do is think about creating some type of reporting code of ethics. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't report on ransomware, but what I mean here is that we should think a bit more carefully about how we report on ransomware in the same way as we do with, for instance, terrorism and disinformation. When we think about terrorism, we know that terrorists seek to cause terror. And as a result of that, what we are careful with is, yes, we may want to report on the incident, but we actually do not want to play into the terrorist's hands and spread this fear. The same way here with ransomware, is we have to be very careful that when we write about these groups, that we're actually not building up their reputation in a way that they can leverage that against their victims and become more profitable. Thanks. These were my slides, and happy to now turn to the Q&A. Over to you, Julia.